Hello, welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to specifically talk about the lipids and their different categories, their structures, and the functions. Particularly for the different scenarios where we will find lipids as molecules within the cell and different parts of the body, right? So lipids different from carbohydrates. In carbohydrates, we have mentioned before that carbohydrates are quick fuel and short-term energy. So you eat something sweet and immediately gives you energy, immediately pumps you up, starts to provide a lot of energy in the short term, but the lipids will contain a higher amount of energy and it will be for longer periods of time. So lipids, unlike proteins or carbohydrates, as you can see here in the left side of the screen, lipids provide a little bit more than double of the energy that you can actually get from carbohydrates and proteins. So lipids, because of this, the word that describes them to be super powerful for energy is something that we say that is hypercaloric. That means that they provide a lot of calories, which means that they're very effective at providing energy. The thing is, most of the time we don't need that much energy anymore. So most of this will be stored for later use in the long term. So lipids are mostly for storage of energy in the long term aspect. And another quality of lipids that is different from the other ones is, if you've seen like this diagram that is in the right side of the screen, like when you mix oil and water, you'll find that oil and water does not mix. This is due to a characteristic that is called hydrophobic. Hydro for water and phobia for fear or rejection. So lipids are not very well dissolving in water. In other words, oils, fats, butter, like this kind of products are going to be mixing very difficult with water, if at all they mix. Most of the time, you might remember when you get when you get oil in your hands, you actually need soap to get rid of that. Soap and probably hot water to get rid of that, because they're not very good at mixing with water. So this is also known as hydrophobic. Speaking of the different types different type of lipids that we will study three in particular. The first one is known as triglyceride. This is the diet type of lipid that we get. When you eat something that has a lot of fat or oil, we're basically focusing on the triglyceride type of lipid, the one that it provides, that it gives us energy, that we store it in our body, and it has different characteristics, as we will see in a minute. Another classification of this is a phospholipid. This phospholipid, it's this one that it's on the right side of the screen, this structure right over here. That is the main component, or is the main molecule that makes up the cell membrane, which is a part of the cell that we will learn next partial when we start to study cells and the different structures that make up the cell. So for now, what you need to know is a phospholipid is making the cell membrane, and it's a type of lipid. And don't forget about the monomer, which is also an important aspect for each molecule. The monomer for both triglyceride and phospholipids will be considered to be the fatty acid, which, by the way, this molecule right here on the left bottom part of the screen, this is a triglyceride. It's called triglyceride because the tri part, which means three, it means for three fatty acids. This zigzag lines that you see here, each of these zigzag line that starts with these circles is one fatty acid. So this molecule has 1, 2, 3 fatty acids connected to one backbone, and that is called glycerol, by the way. That's why the name is triglyceride, which is for energy storage. And lastly, the third type of molecule, or the third type of lipid that we will learn, is called the steroid. This includes the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, which themselves are actually derived or as a consequence of chemical reactions that go through the molecule of cholesterol. Also related to this one is the hormone cortisol, which is the hormone for stress, particularly stress in our bodies, right? Due to anxiety or any situation in our lives. So all of these are hormones, and they work under this category of steroids, which is inside the category of a lipid. And all of the steroids are very easily identified because you will find this configuration of geometric shapes that are like this 3 hexagons and 1 pentagon coming together. So regardless of what the molecule has attached to it, if you see this configuration of 4 rings attached one with the other one, that would be a hint for a steroid molecule. So coming back to triglycerides, specifically for the one that we get from our diet, again, the monomer being the fatty acid, we're going to be discussing about that this triglycerides can be in 2 types or 2 configurations. We would have, this is probably what you hear the more commonly in the everyday, where we have a saturated fat or unsaturated fat, basically. And this unsaturated fat, you may also have heard about this as the good fat or the bad fat, which is basically depending on the food source, if it's animal or plant source, mostly, and the chemical composition, how it's actually made up of. Now, details of this, you will learn it in chemistry, and here we're going to focus about the overall function and how to categorize as saturated, unsaturated, depending on the type of food source. So we have mentioned before the lipids, as their main function is for long-term energy storage, but also for insulation and protection to our organs. So because we have it in between the organs and around our skin and all that, it also creates this protective cushion that helps our organs not to be immediately damaged if we get a hit or if we have an impact directly into our body. Talking about the unsaturated and saturated quality or characteristic of lipids, we can actually classify them according to their origin, as we said. So we can have either the plant origin or the animal origin. Most of the time that we're talking about plant origin, we're talking about oils. Think about the different cooking oils that you have heard before. Probably avocado oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, like all of these different oils are coming actually from plants. Coconut oil, like that. And because they come from plants, by definition, we're going to be talking that these are unsaturated fats. Again, later we can see the details, chemically speaking, what does it mean to be saturated or unsaturated? But for now, let's just keep it as a concept, as a definition. So the lipids that come from plants, by definition, they will be unsaturated, and because of that, they will also be liquid at room temperature, or even if you put them into the fridge, right? If you've ever eaten or had like a bowl of something that is very fatty, for example, like the frijoles a la charra, you might actually see in the fridge, after a long while, a very white, thick layer on top, which is pure fat, right? So if you actually take that away, the quantity of fat within your dish dramatically lowers. And this fat that actually became very white and on the top of the layer, that's actually the animal origin fat that this particular dish have. Because this type of fats that come from animals, probably like bacon or ham that are added to this particular dish, they contain saturated fatty acids. And different from the oils, these saturated fatty acids are basically solid at room temperature. So if you leave them alone for a while, like butter, for example, if you can melt it, but if you leave it in there or put it back into the fridge, eventually this butter will come back into the solid form because they're saturated fatty acids. So the point is, we can have different origins from animal and plant, and each of them will have a particular characteristic. Animal would be saturated and solid at room temperature. Think butter or lard, L-A-R-D. Lard means manteca in English. And in the plant origin, think oil, like cooking oil. Again, these two are examples of the triglyceride, where we mentioned before that triglycerides can be either in their saturated or unsaturated configuration. Now, this saturated, unsaturated configuration, you can see it in the nutrition fact label. You can actually visualize this stuff, including how many carbohydrates, how many proteins, how much fat is there. But for example, in this label on the left, which I'm covering in here, so this nutrition label on the left, we have the total fat labeled at 5 grams. And then you see that we have saturated fat as 1.5 grams. So if we have 1.5 grams of saturated fat, that means that the difference must be around the unsaturated fat. And you see here that we have the polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat also expressed and labeled in here, which might not be immediately like full addition, right, coming into the total fat, but at least the saturated fat by law must be expressed. For example, in here, total fat 8 and saturated fat 1. So we can, by subtracting, we can actually get how much of this fat would be the unsaturated one. Later in chemistry, we'll talk about the trans fat, which is also bad for your health, by the way. Right? So if you see a nutritional label with trans fats at some degree or some grams in there, just know that that might not be the best product for your health, right? Now, to explain the second category of lipids, this is the second category of several, of 3 actually, which is phospholipids. We said before, these phospholipids, the main purpose or the main characteristic is that they're the primary components or the main components of the cell membranes and other things that are inside the membrane. But the main part in here is that this molecule has a very particular characteristic in which this part on the top, which is called the polar head, will actually be able to mix with water. But the fatty acids, which is the monomer, remember that, which is these tails that you see here down here, these are hydrophobic. They do not deal good with water. So this is a characteristic that is very special of phospholipid, and we will learn later how this characteristic of having one part that really likes water and one part that really hates water will actually help the membrane of the cell to actually form itself and to be of benefit for the cell itself. For now, just know that phospholipids are lipids and they're making the cell membrane. That's the important thing for this chapter. So you can see some animations in here on how this phospholipid, it looks like little people, right? So where we would have a head that is hydrophilic, meaning it likes water, and the tails, as you see, they're kind of like inwards in here because they're trying to get away as far as possible from water, which the water would be in the top part of this and in the lower part of this, right? So we would have water in and out of the cell, and the tails that really hate water, they're trying to get away as far as possible. Because of this characteristic is how cell membranes are actually made. Another visualization of this is pretty much the same thing, where we have these heads pointing towards the water in the outside, and also the heads pointing towards the inside of the water. Again, we'll see more details of this later when we go into the organelles and the cell structure. The third and last category is the steroids. These steroids, as we mentioned before, you can quickly identify them because of these 4 particular shaped rings together. that is almost like immediately descriptive of a steroid. Now, regardless of that shape, it could be different things. It's not always going to be the same thing. But steroids are these structures, or these molecules that have this structure, which include, as example, cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is kind of like the mother of the sex hormones, because from cholesterol, you would have, through chemical reactions, cholesterol transforming or changing into either estrogen or testosterone, right? Or progesterone, by the way. So in general, all the sex hormones that have or play a role on the female and male sexual characteristics are going to be derived from cholesterol. And this altogether, cortisol and cholesterol, are what we consider to be steroids. Now, again, in the next semester, when we start talking about health and how these hormones actually play a role in your health, we'll learn more about that later. But it's relevant at this point if you start to identify these hormones as being steroids, which means they are lipids. So regardless of that, for now, just know the different examples and that they are steroids, also known as lipids, for this chapter, right? So that's it for lipids, and we'll continue next video with proteins. So thanks for watching.